June 1944, Normandy, France. A German major sat in a farmhouse command post and stared at the intelligence report in front of him. His hands were steady. His voice was not. He had fought in Poland. He had fought in France. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, where men died in numbers that defied comprehension. He had seen everything war could produce, and yet the report in his hands described something he had no category for. British soldiers, surrounded on 3 sides, ammunition running low, cut off from reinforcements, were not retreating. They were not requesting terms, they were singing. He read the line twice, then he set the report down and said nothing for a long time. That moment captures something the history books rarely say plainly. The German military, one of the most professional and ruthlessly effective fighting forces in human history, was genuinely baffled by the British soldier. Not frightened in the way they feared Soviet numbers or American production. Something stranger than that. Something they couldn't plan for, couldn't counter, couldn't fit into any tactical framework they possessed. They expected courage. Every army has courage. What they didn't expect was this peculiar, almost irrational refusal to behave the way cornered men were supposed to behave. This is the story of why German commanders, in their own words, in their own after-action reports and private diaries, described the British soldier as the most psychologically unsettling opponent they ever faced. The Germans entered the war with extraordinary confidence in their own system. The Wehrmacht was built on speed, aggression, and initiative. Officers were trained to make decisions independently. Panzer columns drove deep into enemy territory before defences could respond. The method worked. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in 6. Every army the Germans faced in the early years operated on a logic the Wehrmacht understood perfectly. When surrounded, you surrender or you die. When outgunned, you withdraw. When the situation becomes untenable, you reassess and adapt. These were rational responses. The Germans respected rational responses because rational responses were predictable, and predictable enemies could be planned for. The British refused to be predictable. It started showing up in the small engagements first, the kind that never made the newspapers but filled the intelligence reports that landed on German commanders' desks throughout 1940 and 1941. A British rearguard of 40 men holding a crossroads against a full German company. Not delaying them, holding them, for 6 hours. When the Germans finally advanced, they found the position empty. The British had simply walked away when their job was done. A patrol of 8 men ambushing a German supply column 3 times its size, inflicting serious casualties, and vanishing into the countryside before a response could be organised. Not bravado, not desperation. Calculation. Cold, unhurried, precise calculation. German infantry officers began noting a pattern. British soldiers, when defending, fought, as if the concept of being overrun simply hadn't occurred to them. They didn't become desperate when outnumbered. They didn't panic when flanked. They absorbed pressure and continued functioning. One German battalion commander wrote that attacking British positions felt like punching into deep water. The force went in, but the resistance never collapsed the way it should. There was always another layer. North Africa is where the reputation truly crystallized. The Desert War, 1941 to 1943, was in many ways the purest test of professional soldiering. The war produced no civilians, no cities, just men and machines and the merciless arithmetic of sun and sand. Rommel was there. The Afrika Korps was there. Some of the finest armoured soldiers Germany ever produced, fighting in the environment their doctrine was built for. Open ground, room to manoeuvre, everything the Panzer Arm needed, and the British drove them to the edge of madness. Not because the British were perfect. They weren't. Early defeats were painful and real. Equipment failed. Commanders made costly mistakes. But what struck Rommel himself, a man who wrote honestly about his opponents, was the quality of the ordinary British soldier even when everything above him was going wrong. Rommel noted that while British command could be rigid and slow, the individual infantrymen and tank crew fought with a stubbornness that repeatedly denied the Afrika Korps the decisive results their tactical successes should have produced. Victories that should have become routs kept stopping short. Surrounded units kept resisting. Ground that was supposed to be abandoned kept being held. The Germans had a phrase they used amongst themselves. Typisch English. Typically English. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't contempt either. It was something closer to exasperated acknowledgement. The British would do the thing you least expected them to do, and then they would do it again, and somehow it would work. The Siege of Tobruk in 1941 became the defining example. 35,000 Allied troops, the majority of them British and Australian, cut off in a Libyan port town, surrounded by Rommel's forces for 241 days. German and Italian forces attacked repeatedly. The perimeter was pressed, probed, hammered. The men inside were short of everything, and yet Tobruk held. Not because relief was imminent. It wasn't. Not for months. Not because conditions were bearable. They weren't. Tobruk held because the men defending it decided it would hold, and they made that decision every single morning for the better part of a year. German intelligence assessed early in the siege that Tobruk would fall within weeks. When weeks passed and it hadn't, they revised the estimate. When that estimate passed, they stopped making estimates and started asking a different question. What was wrong with these people? The answer, though the Germans never quite articulated it this way, was culture. The British Army had built something in its soldiers that was almost impossible to manufacture and extraordinarily difficult to destroy. It wasn't blind obedience. British soldiers were famously irreverent about authority, complained constantly, and harboured deep suspicions about anyone who seemed too eager for glory. It wasn't nationalism in the furious ideological sense. British soldiers generally fought for the men beside them, not for abstractions. What the British Army had built through decades of small wars on every continent, through a regimental system that created fierce local identities, through an NCO corps that was arguably the finest in the world, was an almost organic capacity for self-organisation under pressure. A captured German officer, interrogated in Egypt in 1942, was asked what had surprised him most about fighting the British. He thought for a moment, and then he said something the interrogating officer wrote down verbatim. He said the Germans had a saying that an army of lions led by a donkey will lose to an army of donkeys led by a lion. He said fighting the British made him wonder if perhaps an army of lions that didn't need a lion at all was the most dangerous thing of all. The Western Desert was one theatre, Italy was another, and Italy, if anything, made the reputation more vivid. The Italian campaign was a strategist's nightmare and an infantryman's hell. Mountains, rivers, mud, rain, and a German defensive genius named Albert Kesselring, who used the terrain to construct fortified lines that chewed through attacking forces with mechanical efficiency. The Gustav Line, Monte Cassino, that great ruined monastery on a hilltop looking down on everything. 3 major assaults failed before the 4th finally succeeded. Through all of it, the British infantry kept going up the hillsides, not with elan, not with dramatic battle cries. They went up quietly, methodically, doing what needed to be done thoroughly and without complaint and without the expectation that it would be easy. German defenders on Monte Cassino noted in their reports something that appears again and again when Germans wrote about the British in difficult terrain. The British did not seem to be daunted by the objective. Most attacking infantry, however well trained, show some sign of hesitation when facing a fortified position on high ground. The calculations of survival make themselves felt. The British seem to have performed those calculations already, reached their conclusions and set them aside. A German artillery observer watching a British infantry assault on a river crossing in the Leary Valley in 1944 wrote afterwards that he had watched the advancing men take fire from 3 directions simultaneously. He had seen men fall, he had seen the assault slow, reform, and continue. He wrote, and these are his words from a document captured after the war, that he felt for the first time in 4 years of fighting that he was watching something he could not stop regardless of how much ammunition he had. That feeling, that specific feeling, it appears over and over in German accounts of fighting the British. Not admiration, though there is admiration too, something more unsettling, the sense that you were engaged with an opponent who had already decided the outcome and was simply working through the remaining steps. Arnhem confirmed it for an entire generation of German officers. September 1944, Operation Market Garden, British 1st Airborne Division drops near Arnhem to seize a Rhine crossing. German intelligence for once was right about Allied intentions. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the area. The paratroopers landed directly into them. By any rational military calculus, the battle should have ended within hours. The British were outnumbered, outgunned, and almost immediately cut off. They had no armour. They had limited artillery support. Relief was days away and getting further rather than closer. They held for 9 days. 9 days of street fighting, building by building, room by room, against SS Panzer troops with tanks and flamethrowers and overwhelming numbers. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion held the northern end of Arnhem Bridge for 4 days after running out of nearly everything. They fought from burning buildings. They fought from cellars after the floors above had collapsed. When the ammunition was gone, they did not stop fighting. They improvised. They continued. A senior SS officer, writing his combat report after the battle, used language that was startling coming from a man who had fought across Europe and Russia. He wrote that his division had faced determined opponents before. That was expected. What was not expected was the complete absence of any moment at which the British seemed to accept their situation. He wrote that normally, even the best soldiers reach a point where reality intrudes, where the gap between what is being demanded of them and what is humanly possible becomes visible. He wrote that at Arnhem, he never saw that moment. He wrote that it was the most disturbing thing he had witnessed in the war. The operation failed. The bridge was not held. Nearly 8,000 British paratroopers were killed, wounded or captured. In the narrow tactical sense, Arnhem was a British defeat. But ask the German commanders who fought there whether they felt they had won, and the answers are complicated. They took the ground. But they knew, and they said so privately, that the men they had fought were not defeated. They had simply run out of men. There is a distinction between those two things. The Germans understood it perfectly, and it frightened them. What made this quality so remarkable was what it was not built on. It was not built on fanaticism. German soldiers encountered genuine fanatics on the Eastern Front and recognized the type. British soldiers were not fanatics. They were skeptical, dry, often sardonic about the whole business. They complained about the food, the officers, the weather, and the army in roughly equal measure. They did not believe they were a master race. They did not believe they were fighting for a glorious destiny. They believed, when pressed to articulate it, that the job needed doing, and they were the ones doing it, and that was the end of the discussion. That matter-of-factness, that absolute absence of drama in the face of extreme circumstances was perhaps the strangest thing of all to opponents raised in a military culture that valued passionate commitment and ideological clarity. The British soldier's courage was not hot, it was cold, settled. And cold courage is far more dangerous than hot courage, because it does not burn itself out. German after-action reports from the final year of the war show a consistent thread. Units that had fought in the East described something qualitatively different about engaging the British. Not worse, necessarily. Different. The Russians had mass and ferocity. The Americans had firepower and aggression. The British had something harder to quantify and hard to counter. Persistence, patience, an almost geological quality of simply being there and continuing to be there regardless of circumstances. One Wehrmacht divisional commander, writing his memoirs in the 1950s, tried to explain what it had felt like to fight the British through 5 years of war. He wrote that fighting then was like fighting the tide. You could push it back in one place. It simply returned somewhere else. You could inflict terrible damage on it. It kept coming. You could win engagement after engagement and never feel that you had broken anything fundamental. And eventually, like every army that has ever tried to fight the tide, you ran out of energy. And the tide was still there. The tide was still there. That is what they didn't expect from British soldiers. Not the courage, which they anticipated. Not the professionalism, which they respected. They didn't expect the permanence, the sense that behind every British unit they fought, however battered, however reduced, however far from home, there was something that was simply not going to stop. They found out the hard way, from Poland to Norway, from the western desert to the mountains of Italy, from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Arnhem, from the Rhine crossings to the final collapse of the Third Reich, that the men in the khaki uniforms with the regimental cap badges and the dry humour and the endless tea had decided, somewhere early and quietly and without ceremony, that they were going to see this through. And they did. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists, because the history that actually shaped our world is almost always stranger and more remarkable than anything you were taught in school. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. There is plenty more where this came from. And if you have a topic you would like to see covered, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. See you in the next one.